My grandmother and I used to visit a magical tree that could transport you through time. I wish I'd never stepped inside it. Every Saturday morning at exactly 9:15, grandmother would knock on my bedroom door with that special rhythm we'd developed over the years. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 more taps, pause, then 1 final decisive knock. It was our secret signal that meant adventure was waiting, that the mundane world of homework and chores would be replaced by something magical for the next few hours. I'd leap out of bed, throw on my favorite fairy hunting outfit, a purple dress with sparkly stars that I was convinced would help me blend in with mythical creatures, and race downstairs where grandmother would be waiting with our packed lunch and that mischievous smile that meant she had something special planned. The train ride to Willowbrook Station was always the best part of our weekly expeditions. Grandmother would sit beside me in the worn velvet seats, pointing out landmarks through the window, while she told me stories about the creatures we might encounter in Thornwick Forest. She spoke about pixies who lived in hollow logs and left trails of glittering dust, about water sprites who danced on the surface of hidden ponds during full moons, and most importantly, about the ancient oak tree at the heart of the forest, where the fairy court held their weekly gatherings. According to her detailed explanations, this particular tree had been standing for over 300 years, its massive trunk hollowed out by centuries of wind and rain to create the perfect fairy palace. Thornwick Forest stretched for miles beyond the train station, a dense wilderness of towering trees and winding paths that seemed to shift and change depending on which direction you approached them from. Grandmother always knew exactly where to go, leading me confidently through what appeared to be an impenetrable maze of vegetation until we emerged into the small clearing where our special tree stood waiting. The oak was indeed massive, its trunk so wide that even holding hands, grandmother and I couldn't reach all the way around it. The hollow she'd told me about was perfectly round, like a doorway carved by skilled craftsmen, and surrounded by a perfect circle of red and white mushrooms that seemed to glow with their own internal light. During our picnics in that clearing, grandmother would unpack elaborate meals that seemed far too sophisticated for simple forest expeditions. Crystal glasses filled with elderflower cordial, delicate sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, and always, without fail, a package of chocolate-covered biscuits that she insisted were the fairy folks' absolute favorite treat. She'd arrange everything on a pristine white tablecloth, creating an elegant dining experience in the middle of the wilderness while maintaining constant vigilance for signs of supernatural activity around the ancient oak tree. The stories grandmother told during those picnics were incredibly detailed, full of specific information about fairy customs and behaviors that seemed too precise to be mere fantasy. She explained how different types of fairies preferred different offerings, how they communicated through patterns of wind and rustling leaves, and how they would only reveal themselves to humans who approached their domain with proper respect and genuine belief. She taught me the correct way to leave gifts for them, the importance of speaking in whispers near their homes, and the ancient rules that governed interactions between the human and fairy worlds. But despite hours of patient observation and careful adherence to grandmother's instructions, I never actually saw any fairies during those early expeditions. The chocolate biscuits would disappear between our visits, which grandmother claimed was proof of their presence, but I began to suspect that forest animals were responsible for consuming our offerings. When I shared these doubts with grandmother, she would smile mysteriously and remind me that magic required patience and faith, that the most wonderful things in life often remained hidden from those who tried too hard to find them. The Saturday that changed everything started like any other fairy hunting expedition. Grandmother seemed unusually excited during our train ride, humming softly to herself and checking her watch more frequently than usual. She'd packed extra food for our picnic, including an entire second package of chocolate biscuits that she claimed would be needed for a special ceremony she'd planned. When I asked what kind of ceremony, she simply winked and said, "I'd understand when the time was right." Her secretive behavior made me more hopeful than ever that this would finally be the day I'd get to meet real fairies. The forest felt different that morning, charged with an electricity I'd never noticed during our previous visits. The air seemed thicker, almost difficult to breathe, and the normal sounds of birds and small animals were noticeably absent. Even the wind through the trees sounded strange, like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. Grandmother appeared completely comfortable with these atmospheric changes, walking with renewed energy and purpose toward our usual destination. She kept glancing at her watch and muttering calculations under her breath, as if timing was crucial to whatever she had planned. When we reached the clearing, I immediately noticed that something was wrong with our special tree. The hollow that had always been perfectly round was now irregular and jagged, as if something had been clawing at it from the inside. The circle of mushrooms around the base had expanded significantly, with new growths appearing in patterns that looked almost like symbols or letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize. Most disturbing of all, the interior of the hollow was completely dark, so black that even direct sunlight couldn't penetrate more than a few inches into the opening. Grandmother seemed delighted by these changes, clapping her hands together and announcing that conditions were absolutely perfect for the special ceremony she'd mentioned. She unpacked our picnic with unusual haste, arranging everything quickly before producing a thick leather-bound book I'd never seen before. The cover was decorated with intricate symbols that matched the pattern of the mushrooms, and when she opened it, I could see pages covered with handwritten text in multiple languages. She began reading aloud in what sounded like Latin, her voice taking on a formal, ritualistic tone that made my skin crawl with unease. As grandmother continued her recitation, the atmosphere in the clearing began to change in ways that defied rational explanation. The temperature dropped noticeably despite the bright sunshine, and shadows seemed to move independently of the objects that cast them. The darkness inside the tree hollow began to pulse rhythmically, like a heartbeat heartbeat made of pure shadow, and I could swear I heard faint sounds coming from within the opening, whispers and scratches that suggested something was moving around in the depths of the ancient oak. When grandmother finished reading, she closed the book carefully and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Her usually warm eyes had become cold and calculating, and her familiar smile had been replaced by something that looked more like hunger than affection. She explained that our weekly fairy hunting expeditions had been preparation for this moment, that she'd been teaching me to believe in magic so that I would be ready to participate in something far more important than simple forest adventures. According to grandmother, the tree wasn't home to harmless fairy folk, but served as a gateway to something much older and more powerful. She'd been coming to this clearing for over 40 years, ever since she was my age, participating in rituals that maintained a delicate balance between our world and the realm that existed beyond the hollow oak. The creatures that lived on the other side weren't fairies, she explained, but entities that had been worshipped and feared by humans for millennia before Christianity drove such practices underground. The chocolate biscuits we'd been leaving weren't simple offerings to woodland sprites, but payments to maintain a pact her family had made generations earlier. In exchange for protection and prosperity, the women in our bloodline were required to serve as guardians of the gateway, ensuring that the passage between worlds remained stable and that the ancient agreements were honored. Now that I was old enough, it was time for me to take on my inherited responsibilities and learn the true nature of our family's obligations. I tried to run when I realized what grandmother was suggesting, but my legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if the air itself had become thick as molasses. The whispers from inside the tree hollow were getting louder, and I could see shapes moving in the darkness, things that were definitely not human, but possessed an intelligence that was terrifyingly focused on my presence. Grandmother's voice took on a soothing, hypnotic quality as she explained that I didn't need to be afraid, that serving the ancient ones was an honor that would bring our family continued protection and prosperity. The entities began emerging from the tree hollow as grandmother completed her explanations, and I finally understood why she'd spent so many years preparing me for this moment. The creatures were roughly human-shaped but wrong in every detail, with elongated limbs that bent in impossible directions and faces that seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them directly. Their skin had a translucent quality that revealed the complex network of dark veins beneath, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light despite the brightness of the afternoon sun. But the most horrifying aspect of these beings wasn't their appearance, but their behavior. They moved with deliberate intelligence, communicating with each other through sounds that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primitive fear centers of my brain. They were clearly evaluating me, discussing my suitability for whatever purpose they had in mind, and I could feel their attention like cold fingers probing the edges of my consciousness. Grandmother stood beside them with obvious familiarity, translating their inhuman communications and negotiating terms I was too terrified to fully comprehend. The negotiations seemed to focus on the timeline for my integration into their service and the specific responsibilities I would inherit as the next generation of Gateway Guardians. Grandmother explained that the transition would be gradual, beginning with weekly visits that would allow me to develop tolerance for their presence and learn the complex rituals required to maintain the dimensional barriers. Over time, my human awareness would be supplemented with knowledge and abilities that would make me a more effective servant to their needs. I managed to break free from whatever force had been holding me in place and ran deeper into the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs in my desperation to escape the clearing. Behind me, I could hear grandmother calling my name, but her voice had been joined by others, the inhuman entities pursuing me with movements that sounded like branches scraping against stone. They seemed to have difficulty maintaining their physical forms outside the immediate vicinity of the tree, but their presence was still terrifyingly real as they followed my panicked flight through the wilderness. The forest had become a maze of identical-looking paths and clearings that seemed designed to confuse and disorient anyone trying to navigate without proper guidance. Every direction I turned led to the same landmarks, and I began to suspect that the entire woodland was somehow under the control of the entities, shaped by their will to prevent unauthorized departure. Just when I was beginning to despair of ever finding an exit, I stumbled across a narrow trail marked with small wooden signs that pointed toward the train station. The journey back to civilization felt like it took hours, though my watch indicated only 30 minutes had passed since I'd fled the clearing. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes, and every sound made me jump with terror that the entities had caught up with me. When I finally reached Willowbrook Station, the normal world of concrete platforms and metal train tracks seemed almost magical in its mundane reliability. I bought a ticket with money from my emergency fund and spent the entire ride home checking over my shoulder for signs of supernatural pursuit. Grandmother was waiting for me when I arrived home, sitting calmly in our living room as if nothing unusual had happened. She explained that I'd simply been overwhelmed by my first direct contact with the ancient ones, that such reactions were normal and would diminish with experience. She assured me that running away had been expected, even planned for, and that we would return to the clearing the following Saturday to continue my introduction to my inherited responsibilities. The entities were patient, she said, and understood that human children required time to adjust to expanded reality. But I had no intention of ever returning to Thornwick Forest. I spent the week researching everything I could find about the area, discovering that it had been the site of numerous disappearances over the past several decades. Children and adults who'd ventured into the woods alone were never found, and search parties consistently reported equipment failures and navigation problems that prevented thorough exploration of the deeper forest areas. Local folklore mentioned ancient rituals and supernatural guardians, but these stories were dismissed by authorities as superstition and coincidence. The following Saturday, I refused to accompany grandmother on our usual expedition. She seemed disappointed but not surprised, explaining that she'd hoped I would be more receptive to my family's traditions, but understood that some people needed more time to accept their destiny. She went to the forest alone that day and returned with news that the entities were willing to wait for my cooperation, though their patience wasn't unlimited. Eventually, I would need to choose between serving willingly and being compelled to fulfill my obligations through less pleasant means. Over the following months, strange things began happening around our house that suggested the entities were growing impatient with my continued resistance. Electronics would malfunction in ways that created disturbing images on screens and speakers. Plants in our garden would grow into unnatural shapes that resembled the symbols from grandmother's ritual book. Most unsettling of all, I would sometimes wake up to find my bedroom window open and muddy footprints on the floor, evidence that something had visited during the night while I slept. Grandmother's health began declining rapidly during this period, though doctors couldn't identify any specific medical condition that would explain her deteriorating condition. She claimed that her illness was connected to my refusal to accept my inherited role, that the ancient pact required active maintenance by each generation of our family, or the protections it provided would begin to fade. If I continued refusing to serve as a gateway guardian, she warned, both of us would suffer consequences far worse than simple physical deterioration. The final confrontation came during my 9th birthday, when grandmother announced that my transition period had ended, and the entities would no longer accept delays or excuses. She'd arranged a special ceremony that would complete my initiation, whether I cooperated willingly or not, explaining that the ancient ones had grown tired of waiting and would take direct action if necessary. The ritual would bind my consciousness permanently to their service, eliminating my ability to resist or escape their control. Instead of attending my own birthday party, I called the police and reported everything grandmother had told me about the entities and the planned ceremony. The officers who responded were initially skeptical, treating my story as either fantasy or possible evidence of abuse, but they agreed to investigate the forest location I'd described. What they found in the clearing convinced them that something genuinely dangerous was occurring in Thornwick Forest, though their official reports avoided any mention of supernatural phenomena. Grandmother was arrested and charged with child endangerment and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, though the specific details of the case were sealed to protect my identity as a minor victim. During her psychiatric evaluation, she maintained that everything she'd told me was true, providing detailed information about family history and ritual practices that investigators couldn't easily dismiss as delusion. The ancient leather-bound book was confiscated as evidence, and experts who examined it confirmed that the text contained references to pre-Christian religious practices that matched historical accounts of ritual sacrifice and dimensional manipulation. The clearing in Thornwick Forest was declared a crime scene and later designated as environmentally protected land that couldn't be developed or accessed by the public. Official explanations focused on potential archaeological significance and wildlife preservation, but local residents reported that the entire forest had become strangely quiet since grandmother's arrest. The wildlife had apparently abandoned the area entirely, and even experienced hikers reported navigation problems and equipment failures that made exploration impossible. Grandmother died in custody while awaiting trial, her condition deteriorating rapidly despite intensive medical care. Her final words, according to the prison medical staff, were warnings about what would happen to me if the ancient agreements weren't honored by the next generation. She insisted that the entities wouldn't simply abandon decades of careful preparation, that they would find ways to complete my initiation even without her direct involvement. The protections our family had enjoyed for generations would not only disappear, but would be replaced by active hostility from forces beyond human understanding. In the years since grandmother's death, I've experienced intermittent contact from the entities she claimed to serve. They appear in dreams and peripheral vision, never fully manifesting but making their continued interest in my cooperation abundantly clear. They seem to have difficulty operating without a willing human intermediary, but their persistence suggests that they're developing alternative methods for achieving their objectives. Sometimes I find gifts that remind me of our old fairy hunting expeditions, chocolate biscuits, and handwritten notes that appear in my bedroom despite locked doors and security systems. I've researched my family history extensively, discovering that grandmother's claims about generational service weren't entirely fabricated. Records going back over 2 centuries show a pattern of women in our bloodline who were involved with local folklore and unexplained disappearances. Many died under mysterious circumstances, and their descendants often reported supernatural encounters that matched my own experiences with the entities from Thornwick Forest. The pattern suggests that grandmother was telling the truth about inherited obligations, even if her methods of preparing me were deeply traumatic. Professional therapists have helped me understand that my experiences with grandmother represented a form of ritualistic abuse designed to make me psychologically dependent on her guidance and authority. The supernatural elements of her story were likely elaborate delusions reinforced by coincidence and environmental manipulation rather than genuine contact with otherworldly entities. The chocolate biscuits probably were consumed by forest animals, the atmospheric changes in the clearing were caused by natural phenomena, and the shapes I thought I saw emerging from the tree hollow were products of fear and suggestion rather than actual creatures. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the shadows seem to move independently of their sources, I wonder whether grandmother's version of events might have contained more truth than my rational adult mind wants to acknowledge. The dreams continue with remarkable consistency, always featuring the same impossible landscapes and alien intelligences that claim to remember our previous meetings. The gifts that appear in my secure apartment require explanations that stretch the boundaries of normal logic, and the ongoing process problems in Thornwick Forest suggests that something genuinely unusual occurred in that clearing. I've never returned to the forest, and I have no intention of ever doing so. Whether grandmother's entities were real or imaginary, the trauma of that experience shaped my entire childhood and continues to influence my adult life in ways that therapy can help me manage but not eliminate entirely. The weekly fairy hunting expeditions that I once treasured as magical adventures now represent the systematic grooming of a child for purposes I still don't fully understand. The loving grandmother who taught me to believe in wonder and mystery was simultaneously preparing me for exploitation by forces that viewed my innocence as a resource to be harvested. The chocolate biscuits we left for fairies were never about magic or wonder or childhood fantasy. They were payments in a transaction that treated my consciousness as currency, installments on a debt I never agreed to inherit but was born obligated to pay. The ancient tree with its hollow center wasn't a gateway to fairyland, but a prison that would have consumed my identity and replaced it with something that served alien purposes rather than human dreams. I work now as a social worker, specializing in cases involving ritualistic abuse and childhood exploitation. The skills I developed surviving grandmother's manipulation help me recognize when other children are being prepared for harm by adults who claim to love them. Every case I handle reminds me that evil often wears the mask of care, that the most dangerous predators are those who teach their victims to participate willingly in their own destruction by making that participation seem like privilege rather than violation. The fairy spotting trips ended when I was 9 years old, but their influence continues to shape every decision I make about trust, authority, and the nature of reality itself. I've learned that true magic exists in the form of human resilience and the capacity to heal from experiences that should have broken me entirely. The fairy's grandmother taught me to seek were never real, but the monsters she served certainly were, and protecting other children from similar exploitation has become the closest thing to a sacred mission my life has ever contained. Sometimes I still dream about that clearing in Thornwick Forest, about the ancient oak tree and the chocolate biscuits, and the grandmother who loved me enough to destroy me. But in my dreams now, I'm not the frightened child running away from monsters. I'm the adult who stands between the predators and their intended victims, armed with knowledge hard-won through survival and the determination to ensure that no other child experiences the betrayal of having their wonder weaponized against their innocence. The entities may still be waiting in whatever realm they inhabit, patient and persistent in their desire to complete the transaction grandmother initiated, but they'll have to wait forever, because the little girl who once believed in fairies grew up to understand that the most important magic is the power to say no to those who would consume your soul while claiming to offer you everything your heart desires. The chocolate biscuits will remain uneaten, the ancient agreements will remain unfulfilled, and the only fairy tale I believe in now is the one where the victim escapes and becomes strong enough to protect others from the same fate. Dark tales never end here. If you're brave enough, hit subscribe and step deeper into the shadows with me.